If you were to put my hobbies on some scales that measured how geeky a person is, my interest in tabletop role-playing games would probably break them. I've played a myriad of different types too, such as Dungeons & Dragons, World of Darkness, Paranoia, which incidentally is the greatest B-movie science fiction ever devised into RPG mechanics. So naturally, upon receiving my invitation from Larian to see Divinity Original Sin 2's GM mode, I was instantly pondering to myself just what the day would entail. Given Larian's raison d'etre is fantasy RPGs with interactivity, I was expecting to come across something similar to this rather than the more contemporary or futuristic RPGs I'd had more experience with. But my months of playing one character in the recent D&D release were of more use than I originally thought. Upon my arrival, I noticed a small familiar box on the table. During my briefing in the morning as to how the day was going to pan out, it seemed that in order to demonstrate to us how GM mode worked, Larian had used the Lost Mines of Phandelver adventure bundled with the D&D 5th edition starter set. I need to emphasise the fact that Larian had based the scenario on this pre-published adventure rather than the whole game. Upon loading the game, it still felt like Divinity Original Sin as to how it played. The difference is that everything was built from the ground up in terms of where we were exploring and what we encountered. While we took control of our characters when the action wasn't paused, the GM would take control of the NPCs and enemies on screen. Larian's reasoning for this was because they wanted it to be as simple to use as possible, meaning there's no plans to enable scripted movement. This certainly made sense, as the last thing a GM wants is for the code to bug out and his minion not to do what he or she wants him or her to do. As we ventured into the forest, wagon in tow, we were presented with a quandary. There was a wolf eating the freshly killed horse in the middle of the road. It was at this point that the game was paused by our GM to display what was being called a vignette, which players can vote on the actions to take. This is a surprisingly elegant way of presenting an issue without the need to render the game accordingly, meaning that the flow of the adventure doesn't stop to a crawl. Speaking of time saving, by having shops use in-engine trading between NPCs and players, it eliminates the dreaded RPG session that most players will experience at least once, the shopping trip. There is a button where players can request a price for buying and selling items before confirming. Of course, players might have more specific item requirements, so the GM is able to create them on the fly for purchase. It also streamlines combat, which is turn-based, with the GM taking control of the enemy. Initiative is automatically calculated, so no initiative rolls are necessarily required. Skills and characteristics are the same as those used within Divinity Original Sin 2's engine, so we didn't need to keep an eye on which skills we used beforehand, or even roll dice to attack. This may be a deterrent for some, however Larian have incorporated dice rolling should that be your preference. The GM will select the dice and then submit a request for the player to roll the dice. Once it has been rolled, the GM can then declare the roll as a success or failure as appropriate, sending clear feedback by pressing the relevant button. We weren't able to add the skill modifiers found in D&D to the rolls, though it was simple for the GM to adapt the rolls. Further down the line, we came across a goblin camp, to which the GM had another vignette. The options laid out for us were all not ideal considering the situation, so I asked whether we were able to try and trick the goblins into not only letting us pass, but also helping us remove the barricade. Weirdly, this plan worked, and it was incorporated into the vignette on the fly with a separate option. Adaptability is something that GMs have to do occasionally, so the option to adapt is welcome. After our GM session, we got the chance to play around with all three elements of the GM mode. Firstly is the overall map, which allows GMs to import map using any image file. They can then allocate pins to any area they wish, which are also the basis for the game maps. Larian informed me that the game would ship with over 200 pre-made maps, though users can create their own using the map editor bundled with the full game. Secondly, we took a look at building encounters, which is where the bulk of your time will probably be spent. That isn't to say though that it is complicated to use, as it's a case of finding things through menus, dropping them onto the map, and editing their character sheet and items held if they're an NPC. You can also allocate it to encounters, which are groups that are defined by how they see the party, as allies, neutral or hostile. There's an awful lot of versatility with the assets they've created, and though there are gaps in places from the archetypes, most are represented and can be equipped with a host of gear and skills. Items as well have unique properties such as oil drums exploding on contact to cause massive fires, something we experienced firsthand when in our D&D game we set fire to them. Music and ambience are also selectable for those GMs with a penchant for the dramatic. Finally, there are the vignettes themselves, which, like the overall maps, are really easy to create. You can set the image using image files, but you can also customize borders, text, and choices that players vote on. Can't stress enough that this, as an experienced GM, is what impressed me the most. It allows for such versatility that when the developers asked us what the biggest surprise of the day was, vignettes came up repeatedly because of just how simple yet adaptable it was. Were there limitations? Currently there's no functionality for the GM to roll back saves in case of glitches, so things would need to be edited manually. There's also no prompt in place to ensure that players are sure that they want to end their turn without spending all their action points. However, aside from these, what we have here is a surprisingly dynamic GM mode that is relatively simple to use. Most would probably buy Divinity Original Sin 2 for the main campaign, yet the inclusion of the GM mode is not only well executed overall, it could also potentially reach out to more people who may not care a great deal about gaming against AI, but want to create adventures to share with their friends. Compared to say Roll20, it's got a high barrier of entry as it isn't free, but GMs and players have a more elegant interface to play around with. As you can probably see, there's been some footage of Divinity Original Sin 2's GM mode playing in the background, so that you can see exactly how it will look on screen. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing to our YouTube channel, as well as sharing this video with your friends, in particular those who may have a vested interest in tabletop RPGs as a GM. I've been Dave Owen from the 6thAxis.com, and thank you very much for watching.